Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Michael, here we are. It is now, and we set these dates because of what is going on in the world. It is amazing. We are at warp speed. It is April 4th, 2025.
Thank you. I was going to add that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now you're doing it.
Yeah.
For this great reference that people will be looking back to in 100 years.
Yeah. or maybe 2 weeks.
Maybe not tomorrow.
But, kind of here's what's happened very, very recently is Trump held his news conference and held up his chart and imposed tariffs that will take effect. They're not all on the same date, but they take effect, was it April 2nd or April 9th? I think he announced it April 2nd to take effect April 9th.
Okay.
And then there's some countries that have already eliminated their tariffs, so they'll be taken off the list. But that's a small number. But according to the Trump people, there's a full court press going on with the State Department and all of our people who are talking, who are positioned in those countries to say, let's negotiate, let's resolve these issues.
Yes.
But in the meantime, Trump has his announcement, and the next day the stock market dropped 4%, which is a significant drop. It's not an unprecedented drop, but it's meaningful. No question about that.
Yes.
And so I thought what we'd do is, Mike, we'd start with a chart that was in the Wall Street Journal that kind of sets this is a chart from the Wall Street Journal. And if you'd back that out just a little bit so we can see the title. Yeah. So this is what to know about the U.S. trade balance in charts, but this is the main chart that we want to look at. And the gold is in two, there are two shades. One shows goods, and the other shows services, and the same thing is true for the red. And
so, for anybody that may not be seeing this, it looks like a transmission, with the big end on the right,
Okay.
or a funnel or a cornucopia.
Yeah,
and it's pretty clearly an expanding funnel going from 1980 to now, where the imbalances are increasing.
Yes, and in fact, what's interesting is there's a thick dark line that shows the net of the combined deficits of services and goods, and from 1980 to about 1995, that net deficit was very small. That thick line goes right along the zero line. But starting
net means you add the positive with the negative, and you get the average between them,
or
the total between them.
Exports versus imports.
Right.
We were exporting about as much as we were importing from 1980 to about 1995.
So it's a simple way of looking at the relative balance between the exports and imports.
Yes,
and
but starting in
negative.
1995, the difference, the amount that we were importing exploded compared to the amount that we were exporting.
Yes.
And that is the time period from 1995 till about 2005 to 2008. That's when we lost 5 million manufacturing jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And they were exported to other countries, primarily China, but other countries. Mexico got a number of them with the NAFTA agreement, Vietnam, some other countries. But the deficit itself became quite large. And then it stayed large.
So when we say that those jobs were exported, what we really mean is that we made agreements that allowed those jobs to be taken up in foreign countries and closed in the United States.
Yes, the factories.
Yes.
Yeah, and these were U.S. companies would sometimes open a factory in Mexico or open a factory in China. And they would do it under the laws of China, which required those companies to share their know-how.
Yes.
And that was part of for the short term, that made sense to the companies. In the long term, it taught the Chinese how to manufacture things in a very sophisticated manufacturing.
And gave them ownership in the intellectual property
And
also.
it gave them ownership. Well, in some cases, they stole the intellectual property.
That's right.
In other cases, we willingly shared our know-how and our IP. And the result is that China became a huge manufacturer and a huge net exporter of goods. And then in the U.S., the effect of that in the U.S. was consumers got lower prices, but millions of people lost their jobs entirely. And so if you had a $70,000 to $80,000 job and you lost it and ended up having to take a job at $40,000 because that's the best job you could find to replace it, it didn't matter that you were getting goods 10 or 15% cheaper. Your wages had collapsed. And so
if you were still employed, say in healthcare or government or a number of institutions that continued to do well during this, all your goods were cheaper, you still had your income, and life is good.
Right.
The people that were really hurt were in the places that were used to have factories, and this is where you had, the drug crises, you had, a lot of suicide and excess mortality that wasn't there before. It was a blight, sort of a modern version of the old Rust Belt.
Well, it is the Rust Belt. That's what they called it. That's what it became. That's what that area of the Midwest, it became known as the Rust Belt because steel plants closed, automobile plants closed, all kinds of manufacturing facilities closed.
So it's good for some people, bad for a lot of others, but there's also another point here, and that it is a matter of national security if all of these things are made in places that may become hostile.
Yes.
And withhold them from us.
Well, and then we don't have them to one of the things that you have to have as a military is you have to have supplies. And if you're going to fight a war, you have to be able to make your own supplies.
Exactly.
You have to be able to supply your own troops. So it's not just you have to have the inventory at the beginning of the war. You have to have the ability to replace it.
Yeah, and generally the winner in wars are the people with the greatest industrial capacity and economic capacity to just keep churning out ships and guns, and that's what happened in World War II. Rosie the Riveter and all that, these were people who stateside were making the material that allowed the troops to win.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, one of the things in World War II that gave the Allies an advantage, and it turned out to be an advantage that could not be overcome, and that is that the United States was so far away from the actual war itself that our manufacturing and industrial base to make the weapons was untouched. They couldn't reach it.
Yes.
And so we would go we would drop bombs on the German factories, the Allies would, and drop bombs on the Japanese factories. And so
the railroads and things like that, logistical stuff.
We were able to disrupt their ability to produce supplies and to then deliver the supplies. Yeah. The U.S. was untouched by that.
Right.
And but at any rate, so what you have is a situation, and the metaphor that we used either last time or the one before, and we're going to keep using it until the car turns or doesn't, and that is the Thelma and Louise metaphor. And anyone who is listening or watching who has not seen the movie Thelma and Louise, it is a classic. It's a classic on a variety of levels. But at the end of that movie, Thelma and Louise, rather than turn themselves in for more or less a misdemeanor with the police, they drove their beautiful convertible car right off a cliff. And so we are, as a country, to kind of go back to 2024, the federal debt was increasing at the rate of $3 trillion a year. The federal deficit was $2 trillion. Well, the difference between the $2 trillion and the $3 trillion is that government got into the business of making student loans and other types of loans that then were never repaid. But in order to make those loans, the federal government did have to borrow the money. And so the borrowing would show up in the federal debt, but it didn't show up in what was called the deficit because the deficit only included the difference between revenue and spending and didn't include the loans. The loans. But as far as the debt is concerned, it doesn't matter whether it's spending or whether or not it's loans that couldn't be repaid.
So just to take another look at this cliff metaphor and driving off the cliff, what you have is people that are loaning money and pretending that it's going to be repaid.
Right.
That is net of what is happening at the federal level. They keep raising money, and if we keep doing it, there's going to come a point where the dance will be called and a crisis will happen because they cannot pay back the money. It's not there.
Well, and that's what happened. By the way, that is what you and I are talking about now has happened to every country in the history of the world. It hasn't happened to our country yet. Okay, but it's happened to every other one. In recent times, the best recent example in our hemisphere was Argentina was running huge deficits, and the only way they could fund and pay for the deficits was to print money.
Right.
And when you print money, when you just print money to pay for deficits, that is by definition, that is inflation. I mean, that is inflationary. Their inflation got up to 150%. And it was only, it took inflation getting to 150% for the voters to vote somebody in who promised to cut the spending. Now, promising to cut the spending and cutting the spending can be two different things.
Quite different.
Yeah. And that's what we're seeing now in the U.S. with Doge. And so what you see is with Doge, you have Elon Musk and his group of executives who are going into agency after agency, and they're looking at primarily at the systems, and they're looking at the waste. Well, I'm not talking, they're finding fraud, but what they're trying to really do is identify the waste. And Elon Musk is doing something that's really quite interesting because he's leading that charge, and he is probably his net worth has probably gone down over $100 billion in the 60 days that he's been trying to find waste in government. And what we're now learning is that Democrats, and this is frightening to me on one hand, it's sad on another, is that Democrats do not want waste to be found. Because if you find waste, they attack you. And they are trying in every way they can to destroy Elon Musk's business.
Well, the logical conclusion from that is it must be waste that benefits them.
Yeah.
And in their eyes, it's not waste.
Okay.
Because it benefits them.
Yeah. Okay. That's a fair point. That's a really so at any rate, so this is what Trump inherited, and he talked about it when he ran his campaign. And the voters said, "We like what you're saying, and we want you to find the waste, fraud, and abuse, the actual waste, fraud, and abuse." The left, on the other hand's response is to make claims that are not true. So let's look at a couple of the things that Doge found, because when Brett Baird on Fox News did an interview of Elon Musk and the Doge, the main figures in the Doge team, which is a very impressive group of tech
senior
executives.
Silicon Valley people generally.
Yeah, who really understand technology and understand systems.
Yes.
And you had like the guy who looked at the NIH. He said
National Institutes of Health?
Yes. He said there are 700 different platforms or different systems in the NIH, and none of them talk to each other.
These are information systems.
Yes. Yeah. And so they were 700 different silos. Well, if you're going to operate anything with 700 different silos, the number of people that you have to do that is exponentially larger than if you had systems that could talk to each other.
Didn't they have 50 or 70 chief information officers or something in one agency? Some number like that? Some
ridiculous number. And then they spent billions. They spent billions saying they were going to update the systems, paying those to third-party contractors, and they're still operating on the same systems they were operating on in the 90s. And this isn't just the NIH.
I wonder who those contractors vote for when election time comes,
and who they give money to.
Right.
Yeah. And so this was one after another. And in Social Security, they found millions of people in the Social Security database that were over 115 years old. Well, the oldest living American is 114, so we know that every one of those, every single one, should have been eliminated. But they've been in there for decades, because some of them are over like 250 years old.
Well, it may have started when they were 70.
Yeah,
Now they're 115.
Right, and then you add it. But the point I'm trying to make is that when you have people who are in the database who are 170, 180 years old, and we're not talking about a few, we're talking about a lot, even at that age,
Right.
a decision was made at some point to not eliminate those names, to just let them stay live in the system. And you have to ask yourself, why would anybody make that decision? Because when it's that many, it's systemic. That is a systemic problem. And so I have no idea how those Social Security numbers of dead people are being used. I don't know if some of them are voting. I don't know if some of those Social Security numbers have been assigned to other people who don't legally deserve a Social Security number or don't have a right to it. I don't know what is being done with it, but I know that there has to be a reason that ought to be looked into.
Well, the imagination fills the void.
Yes.
We're saying we really don't know, but the plausible explanations are that somebody is stealing the money.
Yes.
And people that are stealing it must be supporters or allied with the people that continue to let it happen.
Yes, or
turn a blind eye to it.
Yes, or they're being assigned to people who are then voting illegally, but because they have a Social Security number, they're allowed to vote.
Right. Because
that Social Security number is still alive, and so that's a problem. But then the other one that they found in Social Security was that in 2021. And I may get these numbers slightly wrong, but directionally it's absolutely correct. There were like 270,000 illegal immigrants in 2021 who were given a Social Security number, and they shouldn't have been. And then in 2022, it was like 500,000. And then in 2023, it was like 900,000. And then in 2024, it was above 2 million. And then in 2025, even though Trump got elected, and was put in on January 20th, there were still 900 Social Security numbers that were assigned to illegal immigrants. And that's illegal. I mean, in other words, doing that is illegal. So I could see how you could make mistakes here and there, but those aren't mistakes. There's something systemic. People made decisions to do that. And Michael, we like to look at history and apply the lessons of history to our current situation. And the two revolutions that I am most familiar with that apply to this are the French Revolution and the Glorious Revolution, which actually the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain took place before the French Revolution.
Yeah, that was in the 1600s, I think.
Yes.
And then French Revolution was 1789 or thereabouts,
yes.
Just after the American Revolution.
Just after the American Revolution. And they both took place for exactly the same reason, and that is the executive branch, which was the king, in both of those countries became so corrupt, and the people who were associated with the king were so corrupt that the people finally rose up. Now, what was interesting about both of those revolutions is that when the people rose up, and in both cases they killed the king. They arrested the king, they tried the king, and they killed the king. And back in those days, if you kill the king, you literally decapitated the executive branch of government.
Yes.
And so then in both
if you cut the king's head off, you literally decapitated
yes,
yeah.
But I mean there is no executive branch. There's no vice king. Mm-hmm. There's nobody who then steps into leadership in the executive branch. It disappears. And so in both cases, the legislatures in France were then the dominant political entity. And in Britain, it was also the legislature, the parliament. And what happened was, in both of those cases, the people who were in those bodies couldn't agree with each other. And so they literally started fighting each other. And in France, the revolution just imploded. The economy shrunk 60%, and it was already weak to begin with. It lasted for 15 years. The revolutionaries were also, eventually the mob turned on them. And it didn't end until Napoleon Bonaparte. Two things. Napoleon Bonaparte came onto the scene, and the French people were exhausted. They were tired of the revolution, and they were looking for leadership that would stop the revolution. And they got Bonaparte.
Yeah.
And in Britain, it was similar in that the Parliament could not agree with itself, and so they went and got a guy named Oliver Cromwell, who had been a captain in the cavalry, and they turned to him and they said, "We want you to be a king." He said, "No, we just cut the head off the king." And so they named him Lord Protectorate. And he was in power for actually a relatively short period of time. He was quite brutal while he was in, because he couldn't get people. People wouldn't agree, so he finally had to, frankly, kill some people who wouldn't agree. And that got everybody's attention.
Well, you have the example of Germany after World War I, where they similarly elected a dictator to get them out of this mess that they were in, and they suffered a terrible inflation.
Yes.
In Germany.
Well, the inflation happened that gave rise to Hitler.
That's right. The inflation was first.
Yeah.
But then you resort to a dictatorship, some kind of authority that's going to pull us out of this mess.
Yes, exactly.
People are desperate for that. And it's worth saying that when you build up this debt that can't be paid back, first of all, the people that have loaned the money lose the money.
Yes.
Okay. It's bad for them, but they're not that great in number. The people that are great in number are the ordinary people that haven't loaned the money. They may not have even borrowed any money,
right?
But they transact in money every day, and then when the government is printing money to pay off all these debts, to pretend to pay them off with this new money, their money becomes valueless.
Yes,
in the Weimar Republic in Germany, it was thousands of dollars for a stamp.
Oh yeah, well yeah, wheelbarrows.
Wheelbarrows
full of currency for a loaf of bread.
Yeah,
and they would pay you 3 or 4 times a day,
so you could go buy something before the price went up.
Yeah, and that led to. As you said, as you point out, it led eventually to the appointment of Hitler, and then an election that made him head of the government, and then he then became a dictator.
So you have rich people that lose their assets, but you have average people who can't pay their bills, who can't buy food,
and who the problems were no fault at all. They were not of their own.
Right.
But what's also interesting, looking back at our country, is that who did the working class, and when I say working class, I'm talking about people who made and fixed things. Who did they vote for? Which party did they vote for in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s?
In the United States?
Yes.
Well, that part of the century was mostly a Democrat. Mm-hmm. We had Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy, and then Jimmy Carter, with a couple of interruptions with Republicans. But the Congress was pretty heavily Democrat,
right? But I'm
for
talking,
decades.
Yeah, and I'm talking about who the manufacturers, the people who were factory workers, they voted Democrat.
Yes, they were heavily unionized.
Yes, but they voted Democrat. Mm-hmm. But what's so interesting, if we can pull that slide back up that we were looking at on the tariffs, what's interesting is that during the period where between 1990 and 2005, where the deficit became very, very large and the factories were closing in the U.S., the people who were being hurt by the policies of globalism were still voting for the party
that was doing it
to them. And so there's a latency period between the time that people who if they are loyal to a particular party, and this would probably be true on either side, but we're focusing on the Democrat Party because of the change that's taken place. The Democrat Party was the party that included the people in the factories who made things and who fixed things, and then they ended up losing their jobs because of the globalist mentality that swept both parties, including the Democrat Party. Okay,
I was going to say the deficit doubled and tripled during that period, but you also had Republicans that went along with it because for ideological reasons, the classical economic theory is that division of labor makes everybody richer if you can produce something more cheaply, where it's more easily and cheaply done, like China or Thailand or wherever we're importing these things from, the consumers are way better off, right? It's the producers that are hurt. And as some of the union
the workers.
They're the producers, the workers that are making.
The people who are the producers.
Yeah, that's what I mean by producers. The people that make the things are the ones that are hurt.
Right.
And as I think it was George Meany, one of the big labor unions said, basically you need the people to buy the services. You
Right.
need to create the demand. They need to have a job in order to buy the things that you produce.
Right.
And when you do this, you start trading this internationally, you upset the balance, and the people here trying to buy that don't have the money to do it. Want to buy but can't.
And it's if the deficit didn't change, if it was zero through that whole period, then people who lost their jobs in the factories would be finding their jobs in something else.
Yes.
Okay, that's what would have happened. But when you have a deficit that is growing and persistent, then the people who lost their jobs making things can't find jobs making other things because the deficit by definition is persistent.
And they go on public assistance and then make the deficit worse.
Or they take a job making 50 to 60% of what they were making.
Yes.
And if that affects whole communities, then it negatively impacts entire communities, entire states, entire regions of the country. And so that's what happened. But Michael, what's interesting is it took Donald Trump to be reaching out to these very people for them to change their vote to somebody. And Donald Trump, and this gets into our constitutional republic and how it functions. Donald Trump, and by the way, he'd been saying this since the 80s. There are video clips of him being on Oprah Winfrey or different places where he was invited to be on a show, and he would be talking about the trade deficit even before it got to be nearly as big. But he'd be talking about how terrible it is. There's so many things that he criticized back we're talking 20, 30 years ago when he was just a business guy and very well known. And he'd be invited on because people were interested in his opinions. And Oprah Winfrey had him on a number of times. And he'd be on the news programs, and he'd be talking about how these deficits were terrible. And so then when he ran, especially when he ran this time, he said, I'm going to impose tariffs and tell our trading partners reduce their tariffs so that we can compete, so that our working men and women can compete. And that argument carried the day in 2016 to some extent, and a material extent. And that's
enough to get him elected.
Enough to get him elected. In 2024, it carried the day to a larger extent. Yes. Not to just get elected, but to actually win a majority.
But so you project that forward, and if this strategy works, and there's a lot of factories being built here, there's trillions of dollars,
and that's what we're going to get into. Please go ahead. Yeah.
To build factories here. And so now if you have this newly employed group of people that actually see why that happened, there will be more of them switching to the Republican Party because they see that their prosperity is tied to having these jobs.
And what's interesting is this. The construction jobs to build those factories should be starting later this year because once you announce, you still have to get permits. What's interesting is this. Michael, the announcements of the factories that I've seen so far, I've not seen a single pure blue state, where a factory has been announced it's going to be built.
Why would you go somewhere where they're going to harass you as opposed to support you?
And yeah, exactly. And then you can't get the permits to build. The environmentalists would be doing everything. And so
everything they could to delay you.
To stop you. Yeah. And so the factories are going to Arizona. I think there's one or two in Nevada. There's a bunch of them in Texas. They're in Indiana. I think there is one in Michigan.
Yeah, I think maybe Wisconsin and Minnesota too.
Okay.
A big chip factory or something.
And the Southeast is getting factories.
Yeah. And
so what's interesting is this, and by the way, those factories will be different than the factories that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. These factories will be the manufacturing processes will be done by robots.
So let's look at it this way. I would say there's none of those factories that I can think of that I've heard of being announced that are in California or New York or Illinois.
Or Illinois. Yeah.
Those are the three places that I would say.
Yeah. Not in Connecticut, not in New Jersey. I mean, not any place on the East Coast. And not in Illinois, as you point out, not in Washington State, not in Oregon, because these are all deep, deep blue states.
Yes.
And so at any rate, so these factories are going to be built, but they're not going to be the factories of the old days. I don't know if you are familiar with the term dark warehouse.
I haven't heard it, no.
I saw a news clip about dark warehouses, and I invite our listeners or viewers to search on dark warehouses. What they are is they're warehouses that operate 24 hours a day using robots.
Oh, so you don't need any light.
You don't need any lights. They have maybe 5 to 10 humans.
I was trained as an engineer.
Where there used to be hundreds. Where there used to be hundreds of
just
humans.
a few people.
Yeah.
And so this raises the question whether that's so good for the working class or not, and because their jobs are not coming back to lift boxes.
But somebody has to build the robots.
Yes.
And so if we're building the robots and maintaining the robots, that includes building physical things with robots, but it'll require a workforce that is educated in a different way.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's another problem that we have is that our education system now is controlled by government employee unions to teachers unions, which is more and more true now at higher education also. So
I just wanted to tell you a little joke about the dark warehouses.
Please.
I was trained as an engineer, and there's a joke about engineers who are playing golf, and they got behind a group of golfers who had vision problems. They were blind.
Okay.
And they were slow. And so there's a pastor and somebody else in the group. I should have thought of this before, but basically they're coming up with charitable ways to help these folks. And the engineer said, "Why don't we just have them play at night?" So, engineers can be really kind of crude in their humor.
Yeah.
But the point being,
well, you always have been.
Well, yes, I do. I share in that. The point being that you don't need light in a factory with robots, right?
No.
There's probably a bunch of other kinds of energy. You don't need healthcare benefits. But another number of other costs that are cut out from that.
Right.
So then people have to get educated in order to manage the machines.
Right.
And everybody's better off.
Everybody's better off if you bring back if you bring back a lot of the manufacturing, then you're going to have 10 or 15 humans plus the robots doing the work of 100 people before. But right now, none of the 100 people have a job in the U.S. because all the manufacturing is being done by cheap labor in other countries. So now we get back to Trump has imposed tariffs. Stock market has had one bad day, may have another bad day, may have a series of bad days, may drop 15 or 20%. But I want to compare this, I don't think we have so far, but to 2029, when tariffs were put in, the stock market had 2 or 3 really bad days, and then it collapsed. But in 2029, in 1929, you could borrow money, you could go on leverage, you could go on margin as much as 90%. So you put up 10 cents and buy $1 worth of stock.
Yeah, so go on margin, I mean, you're borrowing the money to buy it. You're putting down 10%, you're borrowing 90%. So if the stock goes to zero, you still owe the 90%.
Yeah, but if the stock goes down 10%,
yeah, you've lost all of your money.
And you have to sell, and that's called a margin call.
Right.
So if you borrowed money and the stock drops by the amount of your equity, then you have to sell. But if there are many people who've done that, there are no buyers. There's this extraordinary number of sellers all at one time, and there are no buyers. And so what you had in 2029 was you had a market collapse. We're not going to have a market collapse. We may see a drop of 15%, which is meaningful. But let's remember, in Biden's inflationary period, where interest rates had to be raised, the stock market dropped over 20%. And that was just 2 or 3 years ago. It did it over a period of time rather than quickly. During COVID, the stock market dropped 25%, and it did that very quickly. So that would be kind of similar to today. You had an event that caused a certain level of panic.
And the speed with which it recovers probably depends on how quickly these imbalances are negotiated away.
Yes.
And so if some other countries come to the table and say, okay, we've been imbalanced, we've been putting rules on you that you didn't put on us, we're going to fix that. I saw a very interesting article this week that said Trump this is his way of negotiating. And they're saying the people that do the deals first will get the best deals. You don't be the last guy making a deal.
Right.
And Donald Trump Jr. said, I've seen this story for decades. This is the way it happens. And so this is basically a stick to get people to come to the table fast.
Right.
And if they come to the table fast, the trade will be restored. The market should get more confidence that normally economic activity is being restored. But if they're laggards, if they want to fight and put retaliatory tariffs, and then it's bad. Because trade will reduce.
Yep.
And what Trump is saying is, I'm not going to allow that to happen until you fix the larger picture.
Right. But the other thing that Trump is doing is he's cutting regulations. In his first term, he told the regulators, and this was government-wide, whole of government, if you introduce a regulation, you have to cut 2. Now he's telling the regulators, if you introduce 1, you have to cut 10. And so the regulatory state is going to be shrunk. Business will be freer to grow without having to spend thousands or millions of dollars dealing with regulators, which is non-productive. Let's go back to the island. And we encourage our people, if they haven't looked at episode 1 and episode 2, we talk about on the island, we use a very simple model to explain the math that shows increasing levels of prosperity and decreasing levels of prosperity. And we point out on the island that if you have 10 people all working at the same level and producing, let's say 10 units, and then they're all consuming 10 units, then the market is at peak, the economy is at perfect equilibrium. And we said that they were doing that, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And then we said, but what happens if they decide that one of those 10 people will now, instead of working and producing something, we believe that it will be more beneficial to us as a group if one of them becomes the government, and that they go around and they say they're there to serve. And they generally are going around trying to serve. They're not trying to rule, they're trying to serve. But they're now not producing the 10 units that they were producing. So somebody has to do that. So the other 9 now have to work 10% longer. And so then the question becomes, is the government providing enough improvement so that the people are able to produce more in less time to pay for the government without their own standard of living dropping? And so that's what we're dealing with now is we have millions and millions of people who work in the government at all kinds of levels. And in fact, there was even a chart that showed in these agencies dealing with scientific research that every dollar that they give to a university now, 60% goes to administration.
Right.
60% of the money for research goes to administration, which means that it's the 40% that are going to the researchers. And we don't know if the researchers are producing anything meaningful.
And what is the culture that you have in higher academic institutions here? What are their politics?
Yeah.
It's pretty predictable, right?
Very predictable because they support the status quo. But when we go back to Thelma and Louise, got that pedal to the metal heading to the cliff, we cannot continue to run federal deficits of $2 trillion and borrowing another trillion. We simply can't do it. That is, we're at an inflection point where we're either going to drive off the cliff or we're going to slow the car down and turn it. And Trump is trying to slow the car down and turn it. Now,
well, we were saying before that podcast here today that trends happen until they don't.
Yeah.
And you can either wait until they're forced to change, where you live on borrowed money until people will not loan to you anymore,
mm-hmm.
and then there's a crisis. Or you change it and you never get there. You endure the pain now and change the trajectory of things so you don't get to the crisis.
Right.
I did want to say one thing about regulation. We're talking about as a burden.
And let me stop you just for a second.
All right.
Because when you said you can endure the pain now,
mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that everybody will experience the same level of pain.
Sure.
And I'm just saying that so we can endure the pain. It's what you're seeing now is you're seeing a Democrat Party that is so beholden to the people in it are so beholden to government spending that it is the constituency of the Democrat Party that is attached. I'm talking about the middle and upper income people who are associated with government. They are the ones who will experience the pain that the manufacturing sector experienced when those people lost their $80,000 jobs in manufacturing and had to take a $40,000 or $50,000 job. They experienced significant pain by globalization.
Right.
Now, if you fix the problem by shrinking the size of government, it will be a particular government employees. It'll be a large number who lose that job.
Sure.
And may or may not be able to replace that income. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the people that lose their job experience the pain. The people whose investments have gone down now because the stock market is a little freaked out about this uncertainty as things are shaken up. And it's the people that are having to deal with supply chain disruptions. CEOs not having a great time in manufacturing and logistics businesses because all their prices are changing immediately.
Yep.
So there's a lot of pain to go around. But mostly the people that are losing jobs are I would say, the ones that experience the most pain.
Right.
What I wanted to say about regulation is that some people think regulation is good because it makes things better. You tell people how to do things the right way. You know, you and I see it differently, that it's an enormous burden of somebody thinking they can tell everyone else the best way to do things because those people are not smart enough to do it or don't have enough integrity to do it the right way. In any event, regulation is a huge burden. What I wanted to point out is that it's a burden to small businesses far more than big businesses. Big companies can absorb a high level of regulation. They just hire 1,000 more people. They distribute it through their products, and prices go up eventually. Mm-hmm. But their profits are going to remain. They've got investors that they have to reward, shareholders they have to reward. But it's the small companies that cannot endure overregulation, and they simply don't come into being. Or they don't thrive. Yeah. Because there's too much stuff other than selling their product and building their business, too much other stuff to distract them.
And some states, to your point, some states, there's federal regulations, and then there's some states that have many more regulations than other states. And so California is a highly, highly regulated state. And so the point I think that you're making is a very, very good one. In fact, big companies actually don't necessarily dislike regulation if the regulation harms their smaller competitors.
Exactly.
There was a great story in Emily Shale's book, it was the one about the rebels, the New Deal rebels.
Yes.
And she talks about this person who was in the tire manufacturing business. Who wrote a letter to President Roosevelt. And he said, I am a small tire manufacturer. We make very, very high quality tires. Our tires compete very nicely with the major national brands. But we are able to compete by selling our tires at a lower price than the national brands because we have lower overhead costs. By putting in price controls and forcing us to sell our tires at the same price as our national competitors, you will put us out of business because you are taking away our competitive advantage. I mean, so it gets right
It's very clear.
Yeah, it gets right to what your point is.
I am right now participating in a startup that is going to be manufacturing a device that lifts wheelchairs so people in wheelchairs can see over their surroundings in a concert or luxury box in a stadium. But we'll be making these devices beginning here outside Nashville, a contract manufacturer. Well, we're asking the question, how big is this going to get, how fast, and do we need to open manufacturing somewhere else around the country or around the world to meet demand that is expected to come from those places? And just this week, I said to my colleagues in that business, we will not be opening a factory in California, ever.
Yeah.
Because we're not going to deal with the regulations and the harassment. You've done this. You've had businesses in California, and I think you just got out because it's too much trouble.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
I was back in the shoe manufacturing business, I think, and there was Nexus. They were trying to claim you had Nexus there, and you owed them taxes.
You're that's at least 10 years ago.
Oh, a long time ago.
Long time ago. Yeah.
Past your expiration date on your memory.
Oh, yeah.
But I remember it. You get what they call a Nexus now. They're going to tax you. Well, you're really not even in the state.
Tax and regulations, but and so anyway. So getting back to where we are is that I wanted to kind of talk about that you've got Trump and his tariffs. The question is going to be, for example, the European Union is trying to, his tariffs are not being imposed on the European Union. They're being imposed on the individual countries in the European Union.
Okay.
So this is a little bit like, what was that? What do they call that? The prisoner's dilemma, or the where you have three people who are suspected of a crime, and they separate them into different rooms, and the detectives say the first one that tells us what actually happened and throws the other two people under the bus will be given immunity. And so now all of the conspirators now have to decide, will the other guys not tell, or if they do, because I'm going to go be thrown under the bus. And
Yes.
that's kind of what, and so now you have all of these countries from Europe who have their own individual self-interest. And so they're at this point, as of yesterday, they were standing together. But we have embassies in every one of those countries. We have trade officials in every one of those countries. And as we are speaking, I am absolutely certain. Well, I'm not absolutely certain.
You're very confident.
I'm very. Thank you. I am very confident that discussions are going on in every one of our major trading partners all across the world. And here's what's interesting: Vietnam. I believe I saw yesterday that Vietnam has already agreed to eliminate its tariffs. Now, Vietnam is a country in that whole area of Southeast Asia. They are a country of very, very industrious people.
Yes.
They are a country, those countries have governments that are very interested in becoming manufacturing hubs, and now they'll agree to be import hubs, to import things.
Fantastic.
And so if Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, if all of those countries that are adjacent to China eliminate their tariffs, and all of a sudden there are these factories that then move into Vietnam. People open up factories in Vietnam to compete with the factories in China. And then all of a sudden the factories in China are displaced. This is what is going on now.
Right. And the big ones there are Japan and Korea and Australia. Even though Australia may not seem like it's part of that part of the country, it's very important because of its proximity for shipping and all that.
Right.
And then you have the Philippines. But if you had an organization of all those countries that get on board with this collaboration, low tax, low tariff collaboration with the United States, it could be really significant, not only economically, but geopolitically.
Yeah, but I think it's going to be done, Michael, by individual countries. Okay. I think this thing about this, that Asian pact or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the way Trump is going to approach this.
Yeah.
He's negotiating deals with each country.
Yes.
And he'll negotiate deals very quickly. And so the next 2 weeks, the next 2 to 3 weeks will tell the tale. Now I want to move over just for a second and talk about the other things that are going on in Washington that also, I think, relate to what we're talking about here. And that is that you have this so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. And the One Big Beautiful Bill, as I understand it, you can chime in here if you disagree. The One Big Beautiful Bill includes making the 2017 tax cuts permanent, eliminating taxes on tips, eliminating taxes on overtime, and eliminating taxes on Social Security for people who are retired. And then it also will have money in there for the border, and it'll have money in there for the military to modernize the military for ships and things like this that Trump has articulated. And so that bill is confined to pretty much those things. And the Senate has talked about separating the taxes from the other. And Trump has said it's better if we do it at one time because we all agree that we want all of these things done, so let's just do it together.
Yes.
If that One Big Beautiful Bill passes, then the tax cuts that we're talking about will have a very stimulative effect to the extent that people are working overtime and now not paying taxes on the overtime and receiving tips that they're not paying taxes on. And these are people whose incomes are between $40,000 and $100,000.
Yeah. And just to be careful with our syntax or context or some word like that, these are not new tax cuts. They are sustaining cuts that were made in 17. So you're basically declining to have them go back to where they were, which is what current law says they're going to do.
Right. The extension. I'm talking. So the two elements.
Extending the tax cuts.
Extending the tax cuts. Not extending them, making them permanent.
Okay.
Which is obviously an extension.
Yeah.
But it makes them permanent, which means that in order to, you then have to raise taxes in order to get a tax increase. But in addition to extending,
as opposed to having them to go up automatically according to current law.
And then somebody can claim, I didn't raise taxes.
Yeah.
The 2017 tax cuts is different from eliminating taxes on tips, eliminating taxes on.
That's new.
Those are
new.
Yeah, and those will put money. Those three, tips, overtime, and Social Security. Those will put money in the pockets of people making between $40,000 and $100,000. And so that'll have a positive effect on the economy, and it'll help those people weather any turbulence that we might have. If you're a Star Wars fan, it'd be a disturbance in the Force.
Well, the way I read that is you're targeting benefits to certain people, and so that's a political move, and it's a way of containing expense, I suppose. But I really like the idea that everybody ought to have a similar tax burden. The whole idea of a flat tax, so everybody's got a skin in the game.
That may be,
and the burden is generally lower because everybody bears it.
Right.
That's not where we are now. We're basically targeting things to make specific people better off. Well, in this coalition of
extending the 2017 tax cuts helps a lot of the people who are not earning money on tips and who are not working overtime.
Yeah, they get their own form of help.
So they're going to get their own form of help from the extension of the 2017. Right. The people who work for tips and the people who work overtime, they're the ones who are bearing. Quite frankly, they're also the ones who tend to be younger, and they're bearing the cost of Obamacare and the higher health care costs. Can least afford it.
Let me say the point another way is that we have a tax system that's highly progressive and taxes people very little at low incomes and very much at the higher incomes. There's a reason for that. There's a moral case to be made for that. But it tends to teach people that government is free. People who are not paying anything for it think of all of this as free and an entitlement that they have. It's really not.
Well, it's not free, especially, Mike, to your point, especially the deficit part of government. The deficit part of government impacts people from the middle income level down much more than and bad health care policy impacts people who make less than $100,000 much more than it impacts people because it's the same dollar amount. I mean, if your family is covered if you have a family of four and it's covered by insurance, your policy is going to be $2,000 a month.
Right.
If you're making $60,000, that is catastrophic. If you're making $1 million, it's an annoyance, but it's not the end of the world. And if you're making $300,000, it's bad, but it's not terrible. And chances
this is the case for progressive tax rates where you have a lower percentage on some people. Any tax system is probably going to do that. Any tax system has to decide what it's going to tax and what it's not.
No, I'm saying it's the opposite. I'm saying healthcare is the opposite of a progressive tax system. It is the opposite. Our healthcare system imposes enormous healthcare taxes on lower income people and the higher income people because everybody's paying the same dollar amount.
Yes. The burden is higher. A fixed burden is higher on people with less income.
Yes.
I get it.
Yes.
What I'm trying to say is that when you exempt people from taxes altogether, they lose interest in how big that tax is. And if everybody can see there's a burden to government, even if you have a lesser percentage, conceptually it troubles me to just exempt complete categories of income. But you have to choose what you're going to tax.
Right.
I get it. These are complicated matters and a lot of pros and cons.
Yeah. But to kind of try to put a little bow on this, if we were taxing people to pay for the deficit spending, if we were doing that, there would be an enormous pushback on the deficit spending. The people who are being taxed would say, wait a minute, you're taxing me to pay for that?
Yes.
No, I'm going to vote for the other side. Yeah. But what happens is that the combination of the people who are in government or who make money off of government plus the media that supports that notion, it has allowed until Trump, because Trump called it out. Trump was the first. He's the first politician. Ronald Reagan came close, but not in the same way that Trump did. Of course, when Ronald Reagan was president, the federal debt crossed $1 trillion. Total debt crossed $1 trillion, and the economy wasn't even. I mean, the economy was much smaller than it is now, and so what Ronald Reagan was criticizing were similar themes, but much smaller in scope.
Well, to me, this is the point of the emphasis on transparency now, because now people get to see, here's what I'm being made to pay for.
Yes, yeah. And so at any rate, so what we're going to see is we'll see in the coming weeks, we'll see whether or not the Republican members of the House and the Senate can stick together to pass the tax cuts. Because if they don't, the tax cuts are an integral part of Trump's plan to move the economy from being a globalized economy to one where manufacturing is brought back into this country, and there'll be a transition period, and there will be increases in prices of things that are imported where there are tariffs. There will be increases in prices. The amount of them is unknown. People are claiming it'll be this or it'll be that. They're not known yet, but they'll be factored in. But if they can lower taxes and stabilize the tax rates through extending the 2017 to making them permanent, and then also over the ensuing months reduce the amount of the regulatory state, and then in the end of September when they do the budget for next year, if they can actually shrink the size of government, the results of Trump's agenda will be seen.
Yes.
Now, you and I think, believe that if all those things happen, that will be good for the economy and good for the country.
Yes.
But if all of those things don't happen, if only one happens, or if the great big beautiful bill turns out to be the great big beautiful bill light, and if they get into the end of September and the spending cuts are $100 billion instead of $1 trillion, then all of a sudden what you have is a lighter version of the status quo, and the car is now, instead of going 90 miles an hour at the cliff, is going 80 miles an hour, but still heading right at the cliff.
Well, it'll muddy the waters. It'll be harder to tell what is cause and effect, and you minimize support for doing more of this going forward. That's what some people want.
Yes, and then you have the midterm elections that will then come up that will determine whether or not these policies stay in place. And so we are at a true inflection point. I'm going to change gears just for a second.
Okay.
And this will be the subject of our next. We'll go into more detail. But our major economic competitor is China. And they are our major geopolitical competitor. And what's interesting to me, I just finished reading a book that I highly recommend called The Red Emperor by Michael Sheridan. And here's just some interesting things about China under Xi Jinping.
The thing that's tying this together is the role of government.
The role of government, exactly. Thank you. And we have a constitutional republic where the voters chime in every 2 years with elections. And policies can be dramatically changed in a very short period of time by elections. Xi Jinping ascended to the head of the Chinese government. They have different terms because there are three parts of it. He's now head of all three, which includes the military, it includes the civilian. It's all three branches of government, and he ascended to that position in 2012. Typically, they serve 2 terms, and a term means head of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party has 85 million members.
And a term is how long?
4 years.
Okay.
The population of China is 1.4 billion.
Okay.
And so since Deng Xiaoping, now Deng Xiaoping served 2 terms, but then he remained a very powerful person out of office. Okay. and all the people who have followed Deng Xiaoping have served 2 terms, and it might be 5 years, it might be 4, but they've served twice, and then they've been replaced by another person.
Deng Xiaoping was what, 80s or 90s, something like that?
He was 1980.
80, okay.
That way, he took the Cultural Revolution. Ended in 76.
Okay.
And so 76 would have been the rise of Deng Xiaoping.
So you've had a series of people that had 2 terms, kind of like 2-term presidencies in the United States, and then out.
Right. And they were they were modernizing China. Since Deng Xiaoping, they modernized China, working in the global community. They were not outwardly hostile, and they were not outwardly hostile within their area of the world. Since Xi Jinping has taken control of China, they have become much more aggressive in their area of the world and much more aggressive in other areas of the world that are not militarily, but using cyber, spying, all kinds of different things. Yeah, hacking, all kinds of different things. But Xi Jinping,
is he in his 2nd term now?
Well, he's now done away with the terms.
Okay, this is my point.
That's very key.
Yeah, he got in what?
2012.
12. Okay.
Yeah, he's now emperor for life.
He's far past two 4-year terms.
Yes, and there's no process in place to replace him. And this is very important. And this gets into this question. He is now turning China back into a hardcore Marxist economy, where the central government plans everything. It'll be somewhere between a Marxist and a fascist economy, because there are still private ownership of business. But if you don't adhere to what the central government tells you to do, you will be disappeared. And
a new verb. To be disappeared.
Yes. And since Deng Xiaoping has become, this is in Michael Sheridan's book, since Deng Xiaoping has ascended to his position, there have been 2 million Chinese people who have been investigated, indicted, and convicted of various forms of corruption. 2 million.
They have been disappeared, meaning we don't know where they are.
They're in jail. No, they're in prison.
We know
where they are.
Okay.
But many of them were people in the Communist Chinese Party. He has purged the party of anyone who might be considered. This is very emperor. This is very much like the emperors of old in China.
So we're often told that the United States has much higher imprisonment rates than anywhere else in the world. But you're telling me there are millions of people in Chinese jails.
Yes. Yeah. And they're in jail more for what I would call political crimes than for actual crimes. But Deng Xiaoping he's controlling China now with an iron fist, and he's not going to be replaced. He's eliminated that process. Now their economy is weak. I shouldn't say weak. It has structural problems. He way overinvested in housing and there are lots of incentives within the government.
These big residential buildings that now stand empty and rotting.
Yes, there's according to the Wall Street Journal, there are 90 million empty or half-built, partially built residential units that are not being occupied. 90 million. And that's a number that I can't comprehend.
And it's probably mostly big towers that may have 1,000 in each tower or something. But 90 million, even at 1,000 per tower, is a lot of towers that have nobody in them.
Whole cities that are empty, that were built, ghost cities. And those ghost cities include office buildings. They include shopping malls. They include all kinds of things. But a big part of China's economy is the export economy. And so what Trump is doing is a direct challenge to the business model of China. And the question is going to be, in my opinion, is whether or not I'm going to call it the political stability of an absolute dictator can defeat the political stability of a constitutionally elected government.
Well, if you reduce their income with these tariffs so that they are unable to earn what they've been earning, they then can't pay their bills. There's a lot of debt internally in China. This is what you mean by a direct challenge to their business model, is that they may have the crisis earlier than otherwise.
Right. Yes, but then the question is the people in the United States. If there's enough quote disturbance in the force in the United States, the midterms there could be a change in the power structure in Washington, and then that power structure is much more pro-government. Would then be much more pro-government, and would be actually be much more aligned with the interests of the Communist Chinese Party than it would be with Trump. I mean, this is where we are at this time. Is you can't find a Democrat who can identify a single federal employee that should be terminated for waste. Not one. And that is. I mean, you've heard them talk about waste, fraud, and abuse, until actually somebody actually says, "Well, let's reduce it." Because Obama talked about it, had a whole commission, and then took the commission and tabled it, didn't do a thing. In fact, the only thing Obama did that has a truly lasting effect is the Obamacare.
Yeah.
But here we sit, and we'll talk more about China's structure and what's going on in our next podcast. But where we sit today, and it'll be interesting what happens in the next week. Where we sit today is you've got these tariffs that have been imposed. You have negotiations behind the scenes going on in every country as we speak, and whether or not those negotiations bear fruit, and kind of help us rectify the ship and turn the car. That'll be these are things that we won't be talking.
A lot of metaphors there. We're turning a ship and what is it?
Yeah,
changing the ship and the car.
It's the captain of the car. Yeah, the captain of the car. Yeah.
We're in the logistics business today.
But you get the point. So we're at a point, and I'm 76, and I've never seen so many things going on at one time. But I also think that as a 76-year-old, I've never seen our federal government get so out of size, out of proportion to where it's been in the past. What's happened? We went from 20% government spending to 25% of our economy. That is a huge increase, and that is not. You can't continue to do that. Now, how it's resolved will either be in some fashion like we're looking at now, or it'll be resolved in something like what happened in Argentina, and we'll just have to wait to see. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I've been around long enough to see the can kick down the road a lot. For decades, these crises would be, Social Security solvency, other things like that. There would be a big crisis come along, and they'd find some way to muddle through and really postpone the crisis. And kind of what we're seeing now is that we're taking the crisis by the horns and trying to do something about it. It does involve a lot of uncertainty and pain and strife. Mm-hmm. But it's a necessary project, in my opinion.
Well, and we'll find out whether or not over the next, Trump's got literally until the November 2026 elections to prove his theory. And if he does, and if the Republicans will stick together, that's the other part that's interesting, is that Trump ran on a very, very, and by the way, I encourage our listeners and our viewers to look up the Republican platform of 2024. It's not very long. It's maybe 15 to 20 pages. It doesn't take long to read it. And Trump said, this is what our party stands for. And so I would encourage people to read it and say, do I agree or disagree with that? Because that is what Trump is. Trump is absolutely doing what he said he would do. And that's really what our system is devised to let the people elect the government based on what the government, the candidates claim they will do. So we'll see.
I'll say one word about urgency here,
Sure.
And that is the faster these things can be resolved, the better.
Mm-hmm.
That creates a problem in that people that don't want this resolved just have to try to play out the game. You see this with Putin now because Trump is trying to resolve something about Ukraine and Russia. He's beaten up Ukraine pretty much to get them to come to the table and make a deal. Now Putin is saying, well, we want them replaced by a United Nations protectorate. He's playing out the game. He thinks he's going to win by just not going along. And so this gives power to people that won't bring a quick resolution to things.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way.
That's what Trump is dealing with, is who's going to deal with it now and resolve it, who's going to drag him out and try to put this off.
Putin can do that even if it harms his people because he's a dictator.
Yes.
Whether or not an elected official can. One final point to your point, and that is that Russia was not on the list of countries that are being tariffed. And some people have claimed, see there, it's Russia, Russia, Russia.
Yeah, he's in bed with Russia.
Well, that's what they claim.
That's what they say, yeah.
But 2 or 3 weeks ago, Trump imposed like 100% sanctions.
Right.
So you can't put...
his rationale was we've already sanctioned these people. We don't have meaningful trade with them.
There's nothing... Yeah, we don't have meaningful trade, and there's nothing else we can do.
Yeah.
Because I've already sanctioned them. I've already said we're not going to import anything. So
there's 4 countries like that. There's North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, and Russia, if I remember correctly.
And maybe Iran.
Yeah.
Maybe Iran. So at any rate, the Russia is a non-story. But we'll see where we are, and I'll see you
next time.
in the next few times. Yeah, you betcha.